forest is black with frost. A traveler stumbles through snow that reaches his knees. Each breath burns his lungs. The air temperature has dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Without shelter, he has minutes before his fingers blacken and his core temperature begins its fatal descent. He sees smoke rising between the trees, not from a chimney, from a roof. Inside, a family sits by firelight. The room glows with heat. Children sleep on wooden platforms along the walls. The fire burns in an open stone hearth, and smoke fills the upper half of the room like a false ceiling. No one coughs. No one panics. The father adjusts a long pole connected to a vent in the roof, tilting it slightly. The smoke thins near the floor, but remains thick above head height. This smoke is not an accident. It is the architecture. For over 1,000 years, from the Viking Age through the 19th century, the dominant dwelling across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland was the smokehouse. The katutja, Norwegians called it the orestu. The Finns called it the savupirti. These structures had no chimneys. The smoke from the fire remained inside, intentionally trapped. In a climate where winter temperatures routinely kill exposed humans in minutes, the people of the north discovered that the waste product of combustion could be weaponized. The smoke became a blanket. It became insulation. It became the reason they survived. The construction begins with whole logs, not milled planks. Scots pine and Norway spruce are felled and dragged from the forest. The timber selection is precise. Trees growing in harsh northern conditions develop tight growth rings and dense wood. Builders prefer winter-cut logs. The sap retreats during the cold months, allowing the wood to dry more evenly. Each log is carved with a longitudinal groove along its top surface. This groove fits over the rounded surface of the log beneath it. The technique is called scribe fitting. A builder traces the contour of the lower log onto the upper log, then carves away the excess. The result is a joint that conforms to irregularities in the timber. As the structure settles over decades, the weight of the roof presses the logs together. The seal tightens with age. Moisture leaves the wood, and the logs shrink slightly. But because they are stacked under compression, they do not pull apart. They press tighter. At the corners, the logs interlock using complex joints. The salmon tail joint, shaped like a trapezoid, locks each timber in place and resists the outward thrust of the walls. The joint shape prevents the logs from sliding past each other under load. Between the logs, builders press sphagnum moss and wool into every crack. Moss is hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture from the air during humid periods and releases it during dry periods, maintaining equilibrium in the wall cavity. But the most effective sealant comes later. The fire burns for months. Smoke permeates the wood. Soot and tar accumulate on the interior surfaces. Over years, this layer grows thick and glossy. It penetrates the cellular structure of the timber, polymerizing the wood like a chemical treatment. The logs become carbonized shells. Insects cannot burrow into wood saturated with soot. Rot cannot take hold in timbers soaked with tar. Smokehouses that should have collapsed after decades instead stand for centuries. When builders finally dismantle them, they scavenge the timbers to build boats. The wood has been pressure treated with fire. The roof is built in layers. Wooden rafters support sheets of birch bark. Birch bark contains betulin, a compound that repels water and resists decay. Over the bark, builders pile sod and turf. This green roof provides thermal mass. In winter, snow accumulates on top. The heat escaping through the roof structure melts the bottom layer of snow, which refreezes into ice. The result is a complex, multi-layered barrier against heat loss. At the peak of this assembly sits the larder, the roof vent. It is the only breach in the thermal fortress. The leor is not a passive hole. It is a variable valve. A long pole extends from the interior to a cover on the roof. The resident uses this pole to tilt the cover open or closed. The physics of the leor reveal an understanding of the stack effect. Warm air is less dense than cold air. It rises. In a sealed building, this creates a pressure differential. Negative pressure forms at the bottom, pulling cold air in through gaps in the floor. Positive pressure forms at the top, pushing air out through any opening. The leor sits at the point of maximum positive pressure. If the resident opens the leor too wide during a fire, the updraft becomes a roar. Heat vanishes up through the vent, sucked out by the pressure differential. Freezing air rushes in through the floor to replace the warm air. The room becomes an icebox. If the resident closes the leor too tightly, the smoke has nowhere to go. It descends from the ceiling, pushing the breathable air down toward the floor. Eventually, the inhabitants are forced to lie flat or evacuate. The goal is to maintain the smoke layer at a height just above head level. Residents stoop when walking across the room. They stay in the clear zone. The smoke does not fill the room uniformly. It stratifies. Hot smoke rises to the ceiling and spreads horizontally, forming a distinct layer. The boundary between clear air and smoke is sharp enough to see. A person standing can watch the demarcation line hover at chest height or shoulder height, depending on the fire's intensity and the leor's position. This smoke layer functions as a false ceiling because gases are poor conductors, but effective radiators when loaded with particulate matter. The hot smoke absorbs convective heat from the fire and radiates it back down to the floor. The smoke effectively lowers the ceiling height, thereby reducing the volume of air that needs to be heated. It turns the byproduct of combustion into insulation. The management of this layer requires constant attention. A child learns to read the smoke before they learn to read text. They know that pale gray smoke means the wood is too wet and needs to be replaced. Black smoke indicates an insufficient draft. Blue smoke means the fire is burning cleanly. The smell changes too. Fresh pine smoke has a resinous sharpness. Birch smoke is sweeter. Spruce smoke has a medicinal quality. These distinctions matter because different woods produce different amounts of creosote and tar. Excessive creosote accumulation in the wrong place can ignite, transforming the controlled smoke into an uncontrolled fire. The inhabitants develop strategies for living in the stratified environment. Tall people learn to stoop more frequently. Children, whose heads are below the smoke layer even when standing, move freely. Work that requires visibility happens near the floor or near the fire, where the light is brightest. Tasks that require less precision happen in the dimmer zones. Sleeping platforms are positioned to strike a balance between warmth and air quality. Too high, and the sleeper chokes. Too low, and the cold from the floor penetrates the blankets. But the smoke layer alone cannot sustain life in 40 below winters. The older Norwegian tradition relied on the ore, an open hearth built from stones in the center of the room. The fire burns continuously. It provides radiant heat, warming people and objects in direct line of sight. When the fire dies, the heat vanishes. The moment the flames go out, the residents must close the leor completely to trap whatever warmth remains in the air. This system works, but it is inefficient. It requires constant feeding. It wastes wood. The Finns brought a different technology. The hearth is a massive pile of stones, sometimes encased in rough masonry or timber framing. It has no chimney. The stones used are specific types. Olivine and peridotite are preferred because they withstand thermal shock without fracturing. Granite can be used but requires careful selection. Some granites contain quartz inclusions that expand at different rates when heated. causing the stone to crack explosively. The inhabitants burn a fire inside or beneath the stone pile for several hours. During this phase, the room fills with smoke. The lior stays open. The stones absorb thermal energy, heating to temperatures between 500 and 800 degrees Celsius. The mass of stone in a large caius can exceed 1,000 kilograms. Once the wood is consumed and the coals have burned to ash, the residents wait. They wait for the flames to die completely. Closing the lior too early, while carbon monoxide is still being produced, can be fatal. Once the fire is fully extinguished, the residents vent the remaining smoke, then close the lior. The stones, now glowing hot, radiate heat for 12 to 24 hours. The fire is out, but the room remains warm. Some caius installations retain warmth for up to 36 hours in well-insulated structures. This system decouples heat production from heat release. The caius turn the house into a pulsed system. A burst of intense combustion is followed by a long, slow discharge of stored energy. The Finns can survive colder temperatures with less wood than the Norwegians. The efficiency gain is substantial. Where an ore might require continuous feeding of logs throughout a 16-hour period, a caius achieves the same heating with a single 4-hour burn. The caius is a thermal battery made of stone. It is the ancestor of the modern masonry heater, and more distantly, the Finnish sauna stove. The interior space is zoned by temperature zones. The floor is the coldest layer. Cold air rushes across it, feeding the fire. To escape this draft, the residents do not sleep on the floor. Along the walls, they build wide wooden benches called mold bænker. These benches are filled with insulating materials, including soil, turf, moss, and wood shavings. The benches provide two functions. They insulate against the cold radiating from the log walls. They elevate the sleepers into a slightly warmer stratum of air, but they keep the sleepers below the smoke layer. In some Finnish smokehouses, sleeping platforms are built even higher, closer to the heat, but also closer to the smoke. The elderly, who need warmth more desperately than they fear the haze, sometimes sleep on these upper platforms. The cost of this survival is measured in damaged tissue. The inhabitants live in an atmosphere that modern environmental agencies would evacuate. The most visible consequence is ocular disease. Constant exposure to particulate matter and acrolein in wood smoke causes chronic inflammation of the conjunctiva. The eyes water continuously. In the first years of life in a smokehouse, children develop a tolerance. Their tear production increases, but the inflammation persists. In some cases, bacterial infections like trachoma take hold in the irritated tissue. The infection causes the inner eyelids to scar and turn inward. This condition is called entropion. The eyelashes, now pointing toward the eye instead of away from it, scrape the cornea with every blink. The mechanical abrasion is relentless. Over the course of decades, the cornea becomes opaque. Blindness follows. The Old Norse word for smoke, reykr, is tied to concepts of dimness and obscurity. The weeping eyes of the elderly were a standard feature of these communities. In some villages, a significant portion of the population over 60 had impaired vision or were completely blind. The smoke that warmed them also destroyed their vision. Respiratory damage was equally common. Experimental reconstructions of Viking houses show carbon monoxide levels averaging 16 parts per million near the fire, with spikes far higher. Particulate matter exceeds modern safety limits by orders of magnitude. The inhabitants were cold smoking their own lungs. Chronic bronchitis, obstructive pulmonary disease, and pneumonia were endemic. The lungs of adults who lived their entire lives in smokehouses showed extensive scarring and reduced capacity. Lung function declined with age faster than in populations living in ventilated structures. Women and children, who tended the fire and managed the larder, breathed the worst air. They spent the most time near the fire during the heating phase, when combustion was incomplete and smoke production was at its highest. The daily cycle of the smokehouse included a period called the smoke peace. This was the brief window after the fire burned down to coals and the smoke was vented. For a few hours, the air was clear. For the rest of the day, particularly during the heating phase, the residents lived in a toxic fog. Some families developed routines where women and children would step outside during the most intense smoking periods. But in deep winter, this was not always possible. The choice was between breathing toxic air and freezing. But the smoke served functions beyond heating. The upper rafters of the smokehouse, where the smoke was thickest, became a larder. The smoke temperature in this zone was ideal for cold smoking. Meat, fish, and cheese were hung from the beams. The process was not fast. A leg of mutton might hang in the rafters for weeks, slowly absorbing smoke compounds. The smoke deposited phenolic compounds onto the food, creating a barrier that protects against bacteria and mold. The surface of the meat would develop a dark, glazed appearance as the phenols accumulated. Different woods produced different flavors and preservation qualities. Juniper smoke imparted a sharp, clean taste and had strong antimicrobial properties. Alder was milder and preferred for fish. Birch produced a sweet smoke that worked well with pork. The inhabitants learned these distinctions through generations of trial and error. A poorly smoked piece of meat, hung in the wrong zone or smoked with the wrong wood, could spoil and waste precious calories. In a climate where agriculture stopped for 6 months, this preservation was not optional. The autumn slaughter had to last until spring. Livestock that could not be fed through the winter were butchered in late autumn. The meat was immediately hung in the smokehouse. By midwinter, the rafters were crowded with hanging carcasses, strings of fish, and rounds of cheese. The smokehouse made that possible. Without it, the protein supply would have run out by February, and the inhabitants would have faced starvation before the thaw. The smoke also repelled insects. The house borer and other wood-eating larvae could not survive in timbers saturated with soot and tar. Fungus could not take root. The smokehouse environment was hostile to every form of decay except human tissue. The structure itself became harder, denser, and more durable with every fire. When chimneys finally arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries, many families hesitated to adopt them. The chimney cleared the air, but it also vented the heat. The older smokehouse technology was thermally superior. The hearth was not merely a utility, it was a sacred space. In the Nordic worldview, the fire had agency. Every smokehouse was believed to be inhabited by a tutelary spirit. The Finns called it the tontu. The Swedes called it the tomt. The Norwegians called it the nisse. These spirits were not decorative folklore. They were understood as the ancestors who first cleared the land and lit the first fire. They were the ghosts in the hearth. The relationship with the tontu was transactional. If the household were respectful, the spirit would protect the house from burning down and ensure the livestock thrived. Disrespect could result in the fire going out at the worst possible moment, or in the house being consumed by flames. The consequences were not abstract. A family whose fire went out in the middle of a winter storm faced real death. The belief in the tontu encoded practical fire safety into spiritual practice. The primary offerings were bowls of porridge with butter, tobacco, and alcohol. The spirit resided in the kaiuas, or behind the hearthstones, the warmest part of the house. The offerings were not symbolic gestures. They were contractual obligations. Family that forgot to leave porridge at Yule might experience a series of misfortunes. A cow might sicken, A fire might burn too hot and crack the stones, or the smoke might refuse to vent properly through the lijour. These events would be interpreted as a sign of the tontu's displeasure. The offering would be renewed, often with an apology spoken aloud to the hearth. The fire itself required respect. Certain actions were forbidden. Spitting into the fire was a grave offense. Cursing near the hearth could anger the spirit. Children were taught to approach the fire with care, not just to avoid burns, but to avoid spiritual transgression. The hearth was a threshold between the physical and the metaphysical. The warmth it provided was both material and symbolic. In Norway, the Gulleting Law, one of the oldest legal codes, mandated that every farming household brew ale for the Yule festival. The malting of grain required gentle, controlled heat, often achieved in the smokehouse itself. The ale was not for recreation, it was for drinking Yule. The law required the ale to be blessed in gratitude for the harvest and peace. Failure to brew resulted in fines, or after 3 years of negligence, forfeiture of the farm and exile. A portion of the sacred ale was poured onto the hearth, or the roots of the guardian tree outside the house, to appease the underground spirits. The fire served as an altar. Folklore describes the smokehouse as a liminal space. The opacity of the air, the blue haze, was a veil between the living and the dead. The lijour was not just a smoke vent, it was a portal. In some traditions, the soul of the dying was believed to exit through the lijour. The pole that controlled the vent had to be handled with ritual care to avoid obstructing the spirit's passage. The smoke that blinded the living also carried the dead. The smokehouse did not vanish overnight. It evolved through decades of gradual technological improvement and cultural resistance. As the 18th and 19th centuries progressed, the chimney revolution reached the north. Travelers from the south brought stories of smoke-free homes. Government officials and clergy initiated campaigns to modernize rural housing, arguing that chimneys were a sign of civilization and health. But many families resisted. The resistance was not ignorance. It was based on practical experience. In Norway, the orrestu was replaced by the peisestu, a room with a corner fireplace connected to a masonry chimney. This cleared the air, and the immediate health benefits were obvious. Eyes stopped watering, coughs diminished, but the thermal efficiency dropped. The radiant smoke blanket was gone. Families found that they needed more wood to achieve the same level of warmth. In regions where wood was scarce or difficult to transport, this was a significant burden. Some families built peisestuer, but continued to use old smokehouse techniques during the coldest months, closing off the chimney and letting the smoke fill the room. To regain the efficiency of the kaiuas without the smoke, builders developed the masonry heater, known as the kakkeloven. This device channeled smoke through a labyrinth of brick passages before exhausting it through a chimney. The heat was captured in the thermal mass of the brickwork. The smoke was vented outside. The technology of the kaiuas survived in a new form, refined and sanitized. By the early 20th century, most rural Scandinavian homes had masonry heaters or metal stoves connected to chimneys. The age of the smokehouse as a primary dwelling was over. The most direct descendant of the savupirti is the sauna, also known as the smoke sauna. While living quarters gained chimneys, the bathhouse retained the ancient system. The sauna is heated exactly like the medieval dwelling. A massive pile of stones is heated by a fire burned to extinction. The room fills with smoke. Once the smoke is vented, the soft heat remains. Modern Finns still build savusaunas. The kaitatism technology that allowed the colonization of the boreal interior is preserved in the ritual of the bath. It is a living fossil. The Scandinavian smokehouse is a monument to the ingenuity of necessity. Faced with a climate that kills in minutes, the people of the North did not fight the elements with brute force. They negotiated. They turned the waste product of combustion into a thermal blanket. They turned stones into batteries. They turned the logs of their walls into carbonized, rot-resistant shells. The survival was not without cost. The smoke eyes of the ancestors, the scarred lungs of the fire tenders, are the price of warmth in a lethal climate. Without the chimneyless house, the settlement of the Scandinavian interior would have been impossible. The smokehouse was the crucible of Nordic culture. It was the place where the physical struggle for heat and the spiritual struggle for favor were fought daily, side by side, in the haze. It was an oven for living. It was a temple. It was a machine that turned fire and smoke into survival.